Hey Armen, how you doing?
Doing all right, all things considered.
Back in school.
Yeah, back in school.
All right. I want to start off the top with points of clarification. I only have one point of clarification in each episode. I watch it back and I hear things that I'm like, I don't know if that was perfectly clear. It wasn't to me, or maybe the listeners, anybody who happens to watch this, may want clarification. So I have one thing that you said last week or in the last episode that struck me. I let it go. I could have brought it up then, but I decided to save it for this week because it's a Pandora's box, if you will. So you said the words, something like this: Solomon didn't write his memoir. It's like, wait a minute. What's a memoir? A person writing his own personal point of view. And you said it like that. And I'm like, ooh, there's some people watching this that'll be very baffled by that. I think I understand what you mean, but could you please elaborate on what you mean?
You know what's so funny? I was literally about to say the same thing once it came to my turn to do like the point of clarification.
Oh, good.
Not
We're on the
necessarily,
same page.
yeah, not necessarily the clarification, but where I heard that information from. So now I can't remember exactly what I did say, but what I meant to say was that he wasn't the one who, I guess you can say, literally wrote it, but somebody else transcribed it for him. And I assumed that the way he went about it was that he heard Tellurian tell the story, or at the very least, he had the manuscript on hand, but he transcribed it in Eastern Armenian. And as I mentioned last time, Tellurian, and as we both know, Tellurian wrote and spoke in Western Armenian,
And how do
which
we know
is the
that?
dialect used in the Ottoman Empire. So it was actually from another video I saw on YouTube by Vartan Matosyan, who is a scholar here in the United States. And he was actually giving a talk about one of Tellurian's peers or co-conspirators in Berlin when they were on the hunt for the Young Turks. So I think it was, I forget his full name, but Heiko was
Yep.
his nickname in the memoir, and it's from that video that he actually relates that information about the memoir being transcribed by someone else.
Well, you've seen Sogomon's handwriting, right? Were you able to read it? We've seen some documents that were written by Sogomon Tellurian himself.
Yeah, not necessarily even the handwriting, but definitely the language
Well, that's
or
what I mean.
the structure of Western Armenian is radically different than the Eastern Armenian that's seen in the memoir. And again, it's pretty cool just to have these different samples of his writing before, you know,
So
30 years later that he decided to put his story down to word.
So you can personally testify that he wrote in Western Armenian, yet, and you've read the memoir and it's in Eastern Armenian, two different dialects. So what you're saying is that it's not that he didn't write the memoir, it's that the version that's been published has been transcribed into the Eastern Armenian dialect. Is that what you mean?
Right.
Yeah. Got it. And by who? Who is the person that transcribed it?
Okay, I know his name. Let me actually. I don't want us to come back onto this video a third time, so let me actually look it up real quick. Just bear with me.
I've got it. I've got it in my hand, but I can't read Armenian, so I couldn't even pronounce it for you. Right here. Let's see.
Well, you've got it right there. Okay.
Maybe can you see it?
I can't, but I am opening it up right now.
All right. Is it on the first page? Maybe I'm not holding the right page up.
Not on the first page, but he was also the person who wrote the foreword to
Right.
the memoir.
And this was a personal friend of Sogomon's, right?
Yeah, and he was also an Armenian Revolutionary Federation old hand, as we'll call him. A longtime party activist. So, This is the part where you should probably put the Jeopardy theme.
Yeah, Jeopardy music or a ticking clock or something.
Yeah.
Or crickets. There's all kinds of sound effects.
Vahan Minachorian. There
Got
you
it.
go.
And
So,
you know what? There's a picture. So Vahan Mihanorian is listed as the editor, right?
I think it's the way that it describes him is as the person who helped compile or put together the memoir in essence. But as we both understand it, it's the person who helped transcribe it.
Right. Because I have a firsthand witness that watched Soghomon write. And you're like, we won't go into that, but so it's not that Soghomon didn't write his own memoir. It's that when it came to publishing it, he, you know, it's also likely that a lot of because of the density of the information in the memoir, like the historical details, it feels like, at least you've expressed this to me, that it feels like some of those details were probably fleshed out between them, like they were referencing history together to flesh out some of the story. And so, as any author with an editor worth their salt is going to have a back and forth dialogue and discussion and fleshing things out. And so, I assume that Minahorian was more well versed in Eastern Armenian, and that's why he wrote it in Eastern Armenian? Or is there another reason? Is that the more common dialect?
No, well, I'm not sure if more common would be the best way to put it, but I remember coming across, Khorian, if the use the guttural, his memoir, which I think was his memoir from the time of the genocide, that is. I think it was titled The Year 1915, and if I recall correctly, he was originally from Iran, and in Iran, the Armenians speak the Eastern Armenian dialect, and I believe he received his education in Russian Armenia, and sometime afterward, he decided to go become a teacher in the Ottoman Empire, an Armenian language teacher. And when the First World War was about to break out, I believe he was in the town of Trabzon, which is in central Turkey, right along the Black Sea coast. It's a port city. And he was able somehow to acquire, or I think he had his diplomatic credentials from the time that he was, he was able to prove himself, I believe, as a subject of Persia. And that way he was able to escape persecution by the authorities. And I think it was about 30 years later, he ends up in Yugoslavia and makes acquaintances with Telerian, and that way they established this rapport, and that's how I assume he would become his collaborator on his memoir.
Right. And there's a picture, I'll find it and I'll put it up here, of Soghomon at his gravesite with three other guys, right? Can you
Right.
Explain this picture to me?
Yeah, I wish I had that picture on hand as well, but I remember it's him and maybe two or three other gentlemen who are at the gravesite of Mina Khorian in, I think, the late 1940s. But Mina Khorian dies in 1943, if I'm not mistaken. So the memoir project had already presumably been completed. Okay, this is just me looking up some of this information. Again, you like to throw me the curveballs.
Sorry.
No worries.
But on the tombstone, it says like 1943. I believe we were able to discern that Mina Khorian died in 43, so that the memoir was likely mostly completed by then.
1946. Okay, so
46.
That's confirmed.
All right, good.
And he presumably dies in Belgrade, in what was at the time Yugoslavia.
Got it. So
Right.
it was
Able to vindicate my credentials as a historian.
very important. All right, because you're the expert on this podcast. I'm an expert in very few things, but you're an expert in this stuff.
Yeah.
And so the memoir, the first when was the first publication? When was it first published?
So it was first published in 1953 in Cairo.
So 7 years
the-
after Minahorian passed away.
Yeah, that's right. And presumably a second printing of the memoir came out in 1956, also in Cairo.
My copy is a 1956 edition, so yes.
Wow.
All right, so just to cover over that one more time, it's not that Soghomon didn't write his own memoir, but the process was it ended up being transcribed into Eastern Armenian by, what was the first name? Vahan Minahorian.
Close enough. I won't torture you.
Thank you for sparing me. All right. Now, there's really only one subject. Before we move on to we're gonna do a movie. Talk about a movie at the end, but I want to talk about one other thing before we get to that. And I emailed you because this is not just the Soghomon Tehlirian podcast, but it's the Armenian Genocide podcast. Because Soghomon Tehlirian's story only makes sense in the greater context of the Armenian Genocide. So I want to do some more background, go back to the origins, at least some of the characters and the historical details that led up to the Armenian Genocide. So I gave you a broad topic. The Bloody Sultan, I believe, is how he's been referred to in history. Can you tell us what you know about Abdülhamid II?
Okay, so I assume we'll be coming back to this 4 or 5 more episodes.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, I think it's always best to talk about this history by looking at it, I suppose, in concentric circles. So beginning from the outermost ring, if we look at the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, it had, in the years just before Sultan Abdülhamid II, been trying to implement these reforms in the political, social, and economic, military, in fact, almost all fields, in order to overhaul the administration of the empire and modernize it. And Abdülhamid II comes to power in 1876 on the heels of these reforms. And in fact, he is the third sultan to reign in that year alone. So the first sultan I'm referring to is Sultan Abdülmecid the First, if I'm not mistaken, and he was on the throne, I believe, for about 25 or so years. Gosh, I should know this much better, but I hope nobody holds this against me. I just don't memorize these dates.
You said 25 or so that should cover it.
I think from 1839 to 1861, another sultan sits, and so this one, Abdülmecid I, is I think from 1861 to 1876. So for about 15 years, actually.
Oh,
okay. We'll correct this in the next one, but I hope our viewers can just bear with it. The gist of the story is still fairly accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, it's I forget who his successor is, but he only sits on the throne for just a couple of months, and after that, he is removed from power by the bureaucrats in the Ottoman government, and Abdülhamid assumes the throne. And this is a time when the empire is also embroiled in a litany of domestic and international disputes. So in 1875, a rebellion breaks out in the empire's Balkan provinces, what's also known as Rumelia. And the Christian peasants in this region essentially launch an insurrection against their Muslim overlords, not necessarily because of there's a religious dissension, but primarily due to overtaxation. And the Ottoman government puts down the insurrection in quite severe and brutal manner, to the point where you have government leaders in Europe, and also public opinion in Europe just completely incensed by what they think is the Ottoman state's irredeemable barbarity. And in Russia, there is quite a bit of sentiment or sympathy for the plight of the Christians because of the fact that the people in the Balkans are also Slavs, and the Russians also have this shared religious and ethnic solidarity with them. And in 1877, the Russians feel like they are compelled to launch a war on behalf of the Balkan Christians, but of course they're also trying to advance their own imperial agenda. And 1876 is also a very important year because this is when the Ottoman government adopts a constitution and a parliament, a two-chamber parliament. And for 2 years, the Ottoman state practices this very limited form of constitutional democracy. And the only reason that it comes to an end is that the war that Russia launches in 1877 does not go well for the Ottomans. And so Sultan Abdülhamid feels compelled to, there's a very special word for it too, he prorogues the parliament and suspends the constitution, and essentially he adopts a absolutist regime which will remain in place for the next, I think, 31 years. So from 1878 to, or beginning from 1876 until 1909, he is the absolute monarch of the Ottoman Empire.
So
And
let me quickly interject or interrupt. This constitution, if you may just elaborate a little bit upon why there was a constitution and maybe what it was based on, or where did they get the ideas for this constitution?
So this was something that had been long in coming. The reformers of the Ottoman government for a good decade and a half had been pushing for a state that would be more built on more rational lines, as they call it, where governance would be streamlined. And I suppose some would look at the example, at least among these reformers, there were some who would look at how other states in Europe were governed, and they felt that this was a model which could be adapted into the Ottoman context. This did not necessarily mean that when we say a constitution, we immediately think of, the constitution that was adopted in the United States in 1789 or more modern constitutions. This still left a monarch in power, but it was meant to provide a slightly limited franchise. So there would be representatives who would come from the Ottoman Empire and sit in a parliament, which again was made up of two houses. And they drew from different influences. Again, it escapes me at the moment, but I believe that they looked at the Swiss and French and even the Prussian and German constitutions in order to draw their examples. But this was not like a wholesale copy of those constitutions. They still enshrined Islam as the supreme religion of the Ottoman state and tailored it to Ottoman realities. But at the very least, it was a very very real first step in that direction of consultative rule. And this was also the way they sort of justified it, that they could look at Islamic principles of consultation or consulting other ministers or advisors in order to rule. And so it would not necessarily have to always be an autocratic sultan who would make decisions by decree.
So
And
it was
again,
it was an attempt to more efficiently run this vast empire, I assume or suppose.
That was the idea, yeah. And it would have been very interesting to see if this experiment again in democracy or limited democracy would have been allowed to flourish in the years after its adoption.
So, but it was as you said, after a war against Russia didn't go very well for the Ottomans. The constitution was set aside by Abdülhamid II. Pick up there.
Yeah, so the war doesn't go well for the Ottomans at all. In February 1878, they are forced to sue for terms from the Russians, and the Russians at first demand many territorial concessions from the Ottomans. So a great chunk of the Balkans is lost, or the independent or autonomous states are created. And in eastern Anatolia, there are several territories which are detached and which are detached and also become a part of the Russian Empire. And these are also regions which will have significant Armenian populations. So there's also a very important connection in that regard to our story. But Abdülhamid finds the concession so jarring that he feels that the best measure is to clamp down and not allow for these kinds of wild experiments in democracy or consultation, or looking for the opinions or the advice of others. And he feels that this is the much better route, is to actually centralize and consolidate rule in his person. And even though the Russians are forced to roll back some of the concessions because the rest of the European powers are not very excited by the idea of Russia making this many gains, and they forced the Russians and the Ottomans to sign a new treaty, it still does nothing to allay Abdülhamid's mind that the European powers are just out to get him, and well, not only get to him but also to destroy his empire and the state that he rules.
Explain to me just briefly what a sultan is. It's a title. It's a role.
Yeah, it's a title, but this was also the traditional title which was adopted by rulers in the Middle East in the medieval period, and this was a title which the Ottomans adopted once they were able to establish their own principality, and then finally an empire in, I guess we can call it, in 1299, once the first Ottoman principality is established. And so you can perhaps interchange it with emperor. It connotes the same sort of meaning, and in fact the Ottomans did use these terms interchangeably. A sultan or a khan, which is also another word that was also used in the titles, or imperator, all these terms were used interchangeably at the time.
So it's like emperor. Would you also say it might also kind of equate to a pope? For because emperor is more a political role, but a pope is more of a religious leader. Is the sultan also the sultan? I may have this wrong, but isn't the sultan overall Muslims, even if it's not within your empire? Is that true?
Well, I mean, in the Ottoman context, the dynasty that ruled the empire and gave its name from 1299 to 1922 were the House of Osman, or the House of the Ottomans, and they had adopted Islam. Not sure exactly when, but presumably several decades before the establishment of this first principality. So they were nominally Muslim, but they did not necessarily claim. And we're talking about a period of 600 years, so it could differ depending on one sultan or the other, and depending on how faithful or how pious or how seriously they took their claims to ruling over other Muslims or other peoples in the empire. But for the most part, it was not really a title which was deeply enshrined with religious value, or the fact that they would necessarily lead the religious community. They consider themselves the rulers of not only Muslims, but also Christians, Jews, and other religious sects who lived in the empire over the course of these 600 years.
Got it. And, but what's a caliph or a caliphate? Isn't that associated with the sultan as well? Or
Okay, so that's, I think I know what you're referring to. So Sultan Abdülhamid, in order to bolster his legitimacy, adopts this title as well as Sultan. So sometimes you'll see in the text referring him to as the Sultan Caliph. And this was an effort by him to rally the Muslim population of the empire around his person, and again to legitimate his rule. And this was a reflection of what the Ottoman Empire looked like by, let's say, 1878, 1880, once he starts implementing these policies. You had significant Christian populations in places like in the Balkans and in Anatolia. But as these regions were carved away, you had not only them breaking free and these Christian populations being cut off from their former sultan, but also you had an influx of Muslim refugees entering into the Ottoman Empire. And so this was also an acknowledgement of the demographic reality of the Ottoman Empire by the time of the First World War, even, where this was now an empire which was increasingly made up of Muslims. And so Abdulhamid was a very shrewd character. He knew that in order to legitimate his rule, he would be able to employ these symbols and perhaps style himself as the ruler of all Muslims in the world. But this was also a very a very shrewd calculation on his behalf, where he was able to choose which Muslims to advocate for. So if there was a Muslim who was coming from, let's say, the Russian Empire or from Iran and saying that I want to become a subject of this empire, he might not necessarily be so fond of having these guys, settle in his empire, because he would be suspicious of what their political beliefs are, or what they, or would they perhaps pose a subversive element in his empire and also destabilize his rule. So, he liked to adopt this kind of imagery and language, but it wasn't necessarily done out. It wasn't necessarily so thorough as we might think when we hear him using like the title of Sultan and Caliph.
He wasn't necessarily pious or observant. It was more of potentially more of a political strategy.
Well, definitely was a political move on his part, but I think Abdulhamid was a fairly pious Muslim. He was also, I think he enjoyed reading detective novels and smoking cigarettes. So maybe not the exact image of what we might have of a sultan, but he was a guy who, if we try to look at him in a way which is different than how his contemporaries usually present him, which is very paranoid and very suspicious of the people around him. And I think there's a kernel of truth to that as well. But this is also a guy who, growing up in the mid-19th century, is also seeing the world around him change. And I think Abdulhamid is credited for buying the first submarine that the Ottoman Navy, adopts. So again, he was
A man,
I think, first and foremost.
He was a man of
What's
his
that?
times.
Definitely. It's a man who was first and foremost concerned about the well-being of his state, but how he went about ensuring that is, I think, maybe what we'll be getting into in our discussion as well.
Yeah, well, I want to get to that and probably continue it next week, but let me ask you two questions. One is, would the Ottoman Empire fit into the category of a theocracy?
Probably not at this time, if ever. By the 1850s and 1860s, the empire was, as we were talking about these reforms, which I should have mentioned earlier, they're known as the Tanzimat, or the restructuring. So by the 1850s and 1860s, you had essentially a new canon of law which is being drafted, which is also meant to deal with civic matters, and in a way that doesn't necessarily involve religious courts, because religious courts existed at the time as well in the empire, which were governed by the rules of Sharia or Islamic law. But you also had in the 1850s and 1860s this increasing reliance and encouragement by these forward look. Well, maybe that's a little subjective word, but I suppose you can call them Ottoman liberal reformers in the 1850s and 1860s who were encouraging Ottoman subjects to make recourse to these secular courts to deal with civic matters if it came down to adjudication on matters relating to finance or a property dispute. It did not necessarily have to go through the Islamic court. Religious courts still existed side by side, but it was not necessarily. I don't think this would necessarily fit the definition of a theocracy.
Not a theocracy proper, but I mean any more than
or improper.
Or improper, right? Well, I know. I mean, my understanding is, well, obviously there's tension in any political system. There's tension between competing factions, and in some of my research, I recall that some of the objections to the Constitution or these reforms were objections to the imposition of Western culture. Some of I guess the purists would say that that's not the way of Islam or something like that. You don't have to comment on that, but I do want you to comment on, before we move on to our final subject matter, why the name the Bloody Sultan?
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, of course, in any time of great political change, you're going to have these detractors, and you are going to have individuals who are not content with the new reforms. And so, of course, there were some segments in Ottoman society, whether it was from the clerical class of scholars who are known as the ulema, or whether it was more conservative Muslims who were not necessarily fond of these new changes that were being implemented in the empire. And perhaps one way they may have justified it was that this is perhaps straying from the true course of, as they understand the Islamic law or Islamic tenets have laid it down. But again, this was necessarily not the exclusive to any one particular group. And again, some of the most vocal or active reformers of the Ottoman liberal period were Muslim intellectuals or political leaders who did not necessarily see any sort of clash or felt that we can easily reconcile our beliefs with what some may say is Western imposed cultural values. Of course, there was this kind of tension that existed between the liberal reformers and those who were opposed to them, or voiced their discontent with them, but wasn't necessarily guided by one particular person's belief in how religion should be interpreted, if that makes sense.
Yep. All right, give me one example of the Bloody Sultan, and then we'll use that as a teaser, and we'll pick up there next week. We'll talk more about Abdülhamid, but where do you get this name?
Stop doing this. Okay, so I probably am not going to do what you say. I'm not going to be very concise. I'm not going to try to be too concise. So, but to continue along the same lines of these policies that Abdülhamid is implementing throughout the 1880s and the early 1890s, the most important thing that perhaps emerges from this treaty that is signed between the Ottomans and the Russians in 1878 is the special status that Armenians acquire, at least in the international sphere of politics. And they oftentimes call it the internationalization of the Armenian question, or to put it in very brief terms, what exactly was going to happen to the Armenian population, which is mainly made up of peasants and a rural populace in the eastern provinces of the empire, and the question of reforms so that they are able to establish their political and economic and social well-being. And this is something which perhaps cuts a little too close to home for Abdülhamid, who, as we talked about, is now the ruler of this much truncated empire. And in eastern Anatolia, where the Armenian population is concentrated, he sees the first stirrings of what had happened in the Balkans in the 1870s or in Greece in the 1820s, where you have a increasingly politically conscious population which is demanding greater amounts of reform, and he does not want to have any of it. And the measures that he implements are extremely violent. They begin incrementally, where he establishes a special cavalry squadrons or several cavalry squadrons along the borders with the Russian Empire, which are mainly manned by Kurds. The Kurds are a Muslim population which also live in the eastern provinces, and these units are intended to sort of keep the order between the populace along the borders between the Russians and the Ottomans, but they also acquire this reputation for being very brutal and very callous in how they deal with defenseless Armenian peasants. And ultimately, and I guess this is what will be the teaser, Abdülhamid embarks on the severest of measures, which in the 1890s is these wide-scale massacres in the provinces of Armenians. And that's something which, again, leads to him being widely condemned by the press and by government leaders in Europe and the United States and the world over. So that's the origin of the name Bloody Sultan.
Wide-scale massacres, is that what you said?
Yeah, empire-wide, from the smallest towns and villages in the provinces to, the heart of the capital, and have these kinds of outbreaks of mass violence, which are, even though there's no smoking gun, are presumed to have the complete support of the state, or at least the tacit approval by the state.
And this is over like a 2-year period, I believe. 1894 to 1896, is that right?
Yeah, and massacres, smaller scale massacres, do take place in the next few years, 1897, 1900, but the widest instances of violence take place during this very critical period from late 1894 until August 1896, when you have this extreme form of violence, this very violent massacre that, gosh, I should probably rephrase that, this unseen, I think, kind of violence takes place in Istanbul in 1896 over a course of 3 days, where, according to what I've read, thousands of Armenians are killed on the streets of the capital.
Was that related to the Ottoman Bank?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we still going into detail?
No,
on this,
we'll get into that. But
yeah.
Before we move on to our movie, what are the estimates of how many Armenians were massacred in this time period?
So the ones from 1894 to 96 range from as high as 200,000 to as low as 50,000, which it's very important, I think, to put in perspective, because you can take the examples of similar instances of violence that were taking place against other, I don't like to use this word, other ethnic minorities, because there's a whole, that term has to also be unpacked when I use it. But if we take the examples of Jews in the Russian Empire, who are concentrated in this part of the empire known as the Pale of Settlement, and you have these instances of pogroms, as they call them, where the local populace, for one reason or another, blames the Jews for, fabricates a reason to launch violence against them. So in 1881, when the Russian Tsar is assassinated, there's these pogroms that break out against the Jews, and similar pogroms also take place in the beginning of the 20th century. But if you take a look at the death toll, they range only to, only in quotation marks, but the death toll is several thousand. And one reason why there is such a wide discrepancy is because I think the Ottoman state was instigating these kinds of massacres and supporting them, whereas the Russian government did not, even though they may have looked the other way, did not necessarily support these individuals who were launching these pogroms. But again, it's, I think, very important to put it into perspective and try to understand why you have such massive numbers. I think it's something which Ottoman historians will acknowledge, but maybe they don't necessarily grasp the significance. And I think it's just something at which I've only started to consider as well. These very high figures and why exactly they reached these numbers during the 1890s and 1900s.
So the Bloody Sultan oversaw some unprecedented scale of massacre. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and again, I think there's a lot of room for further research on this subject. Right. It's hard to well, it's kind of hard to believe, but it's still something which Ottoman historians have not really, I think, tackled in complete detail, or in as much detail as I would like.
Well, suffice it to say, he was outdone in the next century.
Yeah,
many times over.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on, because that's pretty much the subject of this entire podcast. So we'll get back to that. All right. Thank you, Armen, for introducing us to the Bloody Sultan somewhat. We'll talk more about him next week. All right. Now, this time, I let you pick the movie we're going to talk about. So I'll let you take it from here. What movie did you pick?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just like switching tacks on a real extreme level. So I picked The Irishman, and this is a movie that came out last year, and for one reason or another, I think I decided I did not want to watch it when it was released on Netflix.
This is the Scorsese film?
Yeah, and perhaps most of our audience has heard of the film or has maybe even seen it, but I only watched it literally a day or two after I suggested that we watched it, that we discussed the film.
Oh, okay. And, interesting. Why did you suggest it?
I mean, I've always, I always enjoy historical dramas, and Martin Scorsese always has an interesting way of trying to recapture these historical events in his film. Like if you think about maybe Goodfellas, but also The Gangs of New York, or these films that he's very well known for. But he also has like a very particular style with this film, and I'm not sure if I enjoyed this one too much. I don't think I did, actually.
Well, tell me. Summarize the subject matter. Historic. It's a historical film based on historical events, purportedly. So, can you summarize it in a few sentences?
Yeah. So it's a 3.5-hour long film about a guy named Frank Sheeran, who's played by Robert De Niro in the film, and he plays a mob enforcer in I think it's in the Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and also the tri-state area with New Jersey and New York. And he, in the course of, from the 1950s until the 1970s is when the film really goes up to. And it shows his career and how it intersected with Jimmy Hoffa, who, as we both know, disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the 1970s. I think it was in 1976, and is widely believed to have been assassinated by the mob because of the trade unions that he was the head of had these kinds of connections with the mob back in the day, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
And when you say the mob, what does that mean?
The mafia.
Is it so? Typically, when we hear of that, the mob or the mafia, in this context, it's like Italian American gangsters, right?
Yeah, the Italian American, like the five families that we become very familiar with in The Godfather and its sequels. Is these guys, and I mean, I think these guys are people. Frank Sheeran, Robert De Niro's character, he deals with, I think, are in Philadelphia, but I think they also show like the connections to the families in New York.
And so these are real characters that are depicted. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I had to go on Wikipedia, of course, just to see how much of this was true. But again, to be honest, I don't think the historical bits bothered me as much as the production of the film.
All right.
I'm not sure if you felt the same way.
Well, I want to hear from you first, and then I have prepared some thoughts as well. So, well, first of all, it's based on historical events, historical characters. What's the spoiler? What happens at the end?
So, Frank Sheeran, who again is the central character of the film, and again, spoiler for anybody who hasn't watched it, Jimmy Hoffa dies, and in the film it shows Frank who assassinates him in this home, I think in Michigan, something like a suburb outside of Detroit.
Who plays Hoffa?
And,
Who plays Hoffa?
Al Pacino.
And then who plays? It's Robert De Niro is.
Robert De Niro is Frank Sheeran,
Yeah.
and also Joe Pesci plays Russell Bufalino, who's one of the I think he's a mob boss.
Got it. So De Niro kills Pacino. Is that right?
Well, no, Sheeran kills Hoffa. No, these actors are alive and kicking.
Right. All right. Tell me, what was your issue? Not with the historical events, as you've already mentioned, but with the production.
Yeah, I mean, the historical events didn't bother me too much, again, because I read an article which was talking about how this is really the story as told by Frank's perspective, Frank Sheeran's perspective, who passed away, I think, in 2003. And in the film, you also see him recounting everything from, I guess, like a retirement home once he's reached this very advanced age.
Right.
And he takes credit for, presumably, in this interview that he's also giving, but for taking out Hoffa, but also assassinating another New York City mob boss, Crazy Joe Gallo. And this is also disputed by people who are, write about this period and, study the activities of the mob during this period. But for me, it was really the runtime and also the way that Scorsese tells his stories. I think if have you watched Goodfellas?
Goodfellas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite films, and I felt that after a while, almost every Scorsese film becomes a Goodfellas film, and there's certain elements in it which I really find, I don't know, tedious is maybe one way of putting it. So, first of all, the film's too long, in my opinion, and you may recall, like in the film, you have like Al Pacino and also Robert De Niro's characters repeating the same lines number of times over, and this feels like it just it sends the runtime over the 3.5 hour mark, and I felt that you could easily cut down maybe a good 30 minutes 45 minutes of the film and still not lose anything out of it. But this probably is how people do talk. If you were to sit in a ballroom with these guys, I'm pretty sure there's this kind of banter which takes place, but I thought in the film it wasn't really well served. Again, it just seemed to run down the clock. And so there was that. And there was also how, again, with Scorsese films, whenever he portrays violence, it's very kind of matter of the fact. There's no build-up. And even in this very famous scene at the end of the film where Jimmy Hoffa is taken out in this home, all that happens is that, you remember, like he just, he enters a home, sees that, he's going there for, a sit down with the mob bosses, sees nobody's there, turns around and tells his friend, who he is not suspecting of, doing anything, he still trusts him, turns around and as he is going up to the door, Frank pulls out a handgun and shoots him dead. And, the whole scene ends in just a couple of seconds. And it's, again, something which is very much like Martin Scorsese's production style, but I felt that there was just I don't know, the lack of build up. There isn't as much tension, and you already know what's going to happen because Frank gets these orders from the mob that Jimmy Hoffa should be taken out.
After 3.5 hours, it's over.
Yeah, I mean there was a few parts of the film which I did like. For example, it shows the Bay of Pigs
Oh,
invasion, not necessarily the Bay of Pigs invasion, but there's this illusion in the film that the mob helps arm the Cubans who have been exiled after Castro takes over in 1959, and they launched this very famous but ill-fated invasion of Cuba in 1961 with U.S. government support. And in the film, they imply that the U.S. government reaches out to the mob to help cover the transfer of arms to these Cuban exiles. And I thought it was done very subtly. That one was that part of the film was actually pretty well done. And it was an interesting way of kind of bringing this history to to kind of allowing it to intersect with Frank's character arc and his trajectory in the story. But there was just not too many of those other scenes in the film.
all right, my turn.
Yeah, my rant's over.
So I remember this movie coming out. I remember it hearing raves or people recommending it. It's coming out on Netflix. It's Martin Scorsese and Al Pacino and Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci, and kind of a reunion of these guys who've been in films together over the decades. And so I lay down and, when I watch movies, when I watch Netflix, it's with my wife, we lay in bed, and she never lasts long. So it's usually me watching a movie by myself, as was the case with the movie we talked about last week, Patriots Day. She started that
Right.
movie, and I watched the whole thing, and she was asleep. I got about a half an hour into The Irishman and decided to stop torturing myself. I shut it off, went to sleep, and never paid any attention to it again. In fact, when you recommended that one, I thought about it. I'm like, should I say something? Should I say, oh no, please? Should I say something to Armen? But then I thought, well, maybe you have a point of view. You've seen it. You recommended it. And I thought maybe you had seen it and you really loved it or something. And so I didn't want to rain on your parade, but. I would say that The Irishman is exactly how not to make a historical drama for a number of reasons. Runtime is certainly problematic, though there have been some very engrossing 2.5 to 3 hour runtime films. When I realized that after half an hour, I had barely scratched the surface in this film, I'm like, there's nothing to keep me. There's nothing to keep my attention. I love all three of those actors. I love I'm fans of their acting abilities, but to portray them as younger men with CGI, I'm supposed to get pulled into a story to care about the story. But when I'm looking at three actors that I know, and I know that this is not how they really look, that this is just CGI. All I'm doing is sitting there thinking about these actors and the special effects used on them and how poorly they're pulling it off. There's no interest for me to continue with this story. I don't even care about the facts of history. This is not something that I'm ever going to care about. And it's a star vehicle. It's something that Scorsese's, I think it's his last film or something. Go out with a bang. It gets all these awards, and I'm like, that just proves to me Hollywood is not really objective. They don't give awards to the best art. They give awards to each other as friends. Sure, there's plenty of art that rises to the surface, but this is a perfect example of, oh God, no, please, no more. So. if you want to tell true history, you got to pull people in. And in our story, like the Soghomon Tehlirian story, there's not an actor on the planet that is famous that could possibly play him. Right? He's a young Armenian kid. You can't get Matt Damon, or you can't get, Tom Cruise to play Soghomon Tehlirian. It's just not going to work. And so inevitably you're going to have to get an up and coming talent. And I think that helps the story. In Hollywood, you're like, well, who's directing it and who's starring in it? Those are the first questions any producer is going to ask. Who's directing it and who's starring in it? Well, I'm sorry, in this story, the story is the star. And if it's done properly, the story will make a star out of someone. Whoever plays Soghomon Tehlirian will become a star if the story is told properly. And so...
do I look like him?
Do you look like him? You don't.
Yeah, is
you
there
don't.
a close resemblance?
But you have to have an actor, right? Somebody who's actually talented as an actor. I haven't seen you.
I can act.
You'll have to go through the audition process just like anyone else. And if you're the guy, you're the guy. All right, but you got a better shot than Matt Damon.
Sounds good.
Let's put it that way.
All right. I mean, just to pile on Irishman a little bit more.
Go ahead. I've said my piece.
Yeah, I mean, I really dislike watching any film if it's more than one sitting. So I prefer to just sit down, watch it from beginning to end. And I did not know that it was 3.5 hours long when I suggested it to you. And so I had to structure my evening appropriately. So what I did was that I decided to make something that would take me a good hour or so. And so as I'm preparing the ingredients, I'm watching the film on my phone. As I'm eating, I'm watching it on my television. And as I'm washing the dishes, I'm watching it on my phone again. And again, I just I really dislike fast forwarding it if I feel like the film is not delivering, because maybe there's some genius scene that I might skip. But with the exception of the what is it, the Bay of Pigs invasion and Crazy Joe Galloway's assassination scene, which was actually pretty well done, I think, that the rest of the film was just this slow plodding piece which you were constantly counting down the seconds and the minutes until it ended. So
well, anybody who's watching this, if you want to watch,
sorry, Marty.
Right, sorry, Marty. I do love Goodfellas. He's a talented guy, but I don't. There's not a lot of Scorsese films that I actually really like. So I do not recommend The Irishman. But if you watching this want to subject yourself to 3.5 hours and to prove us wrong, all power to you. But on that note, Armen, are you going to think twice before just recommending some random film next time?
Yes. So I'll definitely put a lot more thought into it next time. I was actually thinking of maybe even doing like comparing series. So, of course, the one show that I tell everybody these days, or at least like the last 2 years, is Babylon Berlin,
Mm-hmm.
and that is, I think, on one particular level,
Mm-hmm.
and Downton Abbey, which I actually finished watching earlier this year.
Oh, nice.
Which is on a different level, right?
Yeah.
All
right.
So,
well, I'm going to make...
Maybe we can do a series.
It's my turn to pick a movie. I've already picked one, I think, that we're going to do next week, so I'll tease it right here. I have repeatedly referred to Soghomon Tehlirian as the Forrest Gump of the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire and World War I. And so I want to do that. I want to make a comparison, or I want to make my case next week. I'll talk a little bit about Forrest Gump, but then I want to make my case of what I mean, and we can talk about Forrest Gump and Soghomon Tehlirian kind of as parallels in our movie section. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, I will talk to you next time, Armen.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Until then.